Simon Sharma said the other day that it is one of the great surprises of the 21st century is the persistence of religion, and he referred to his own grammar school teacher who, in what he describes the quite idealistic time of post-war Britain, said, you know, the one thing we can take for granted is that by the end of the 20th century, nationalism and religion will be almost gone. They will have receded. And here we are in 2014, where there are these domestic cases which turn on religion, and then on the global stage with ISIS and battles over, in the name of holy war, etc. To what extent are you yourself surprised by what I've called there the persistence of religion?
Well, I wouldn't use the word persistence. It was like a sort of recrudescence. And it was happening, I think, we were all celebrating the end of the Cold War, and we didn't notice actually there was something else beginning to form around us.
And just thinking of the fatwa against your friend Salman Rushdie was in the same year as the fall of the
That was sort of the first chapter, really. And I think for our generation, and for those of us close to those events, it really did then shape our responses to what followed. And we took a lot of stick from what one would call the liberal left establishment for saying disobliging things about radical Islam. I haven't received, my mailbox has not been stuffed with apologies from leader writers of The Independent who or columnists suggesting that to say that there's something morally deeply unlikable about the wish to kill people because they have the wrong faith or no faith. Now we watch this rampage across northern Syria and northern Iraq, and you know we're powerless. It's beyond our moral equations. One thing to maybe go on the rampage converting people, but just slaughtering them wholesale, causing one of the largest disruptions of population that, I mean, UN spokesman was now saying 100,000 a month this morning. And then we're faced with damned if we do and damned if we don't. We intervene, but you know, the terrible past of Iraq is behind our shoulders, and yet nor can we stand by. And yet, can we separate humanitarian aid from military intervention? I'm not sure these things are possible in separate.
Are your instincts quite, I don't want to use the word hawkish, but are they activist in this area rather than sitting back and just thinking, well, that's the way the world is? Do you feel the urge that this country, other countries, the United States, should act when confronted with something like ISIS?
I think reluctantly this is so extreme that something has to be done militarily to stop the Islamic State. But I say it very reluctantly because we've nothing much good comes of even more violence piled on violence. But here, could we ever live with ourselves if we just sat on our hands while Muslims of the wrong faith, or Christians, or atheists, or just other Muslims who seem to be the main victims in this case, are put to the sword? I mean, seeing pictures of 200 soldiers with our arms on their head being marched in their underpants into the middle of the desert to be slaughtered yesterday, we seem this summer to have lived through the darkest news cycle I can remember. The unforetellable nature of events in eastern Ukraine, Rotherham, Ebola, northern Iraq. I mean, just sometimes I feel like a rabbit in the headlights with this.
And what do you do with that? I mean, do you look at it and stare at it in the sense of reading about it and listening to it, or do you feel the urge to look away and immerse yourself in, rereading Virginia Woolf rather than dealing with what's going on now?
I become a news junkie all over again. I listen sometimes from 6 o'clock onwards to the Today program. I'm there at the World at 1. I listen to the 7 o'clock news and generally rounded out with Newsnight having read the broadsheets of the New York Times. So if you don't hear from me again in the way of novels, you know, I haven't got time for it. It's so dark. I remember that there's a wonderful line of Wallace Stevens. He says, the imagination always lives at the end of things, and it's always very tempting to think that you live at the sort of end of civilization or a huge turning point. You always think you're at the colossal turning point. It's rare in history when you say, well, there's nothing much happening now. Civilization, well, I suppose, you know, when we thought for a moment, or when Fukuyama did, that
Yes.
Liberal democracies were the only pattern for reasonable living, and it looks like we were all drifting that way. I'm sort of very happy to believe that. And of course, that lasted about a month. So I try and tell myself that actually we mustn't exaggerate our own importance, as it were, historically, because we're living at this time. But in other moods, I think we really are on some pivot. Perhaps the European Union is going to break up. Perhaps who can guess the mind of Putin? Perhaps it'll all fizzle out next year. We'll say, well, we've got rather used to East and West Ukraine. Rather nicer in the West Ukraine, and people in the East are voting with their feet. And thank God we didn't have a Third World War, but, you know, there's plenty of else to worry about. But I can't help feeling, I can't resist this sense that Europe is becoming, you know, home to such brilliant thoughts about human rights and to the great enterprise of modernity and science, great literature, is becoming less and less relevant on the world stage. Its voice and its notions of human dignity and freedom becoming smaller and smaller, and less capable of defending itself or promoting itself. So I think these are anxious times.